SPD should fully eliminate their ownership and use of tear gas and blast balls, in line with CPC recommendations going back for several years. They are indiscriminate weapons.
That is Shailene Morris. She is the Public Policy Director from the Community Police Commission, talking about eliminating the use of less lethal weapons by Seattle police, a complex issue there. The council's efforts to ban those weapons, the court case that has followed that. More on that coming up in just a little bit. But welcome, everybody, once again to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, the coffee break podcast that stays crispy in milk and is part of a nutritious breakfast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel 2. The views expressed here are my own. Joining me, the lean, mean, journalistic machine, Kevin Schofield from Seattle City Council Insight. Hello there, Kevin.
Hey, and I'm lean and mean because I've been eating my Wheaties.
Yeah, you better believe it. You better believe it. And staying out of the smoke, I hope, too. Boy, it is.
Learning to hold my breath for long periods of time.
That's right. All right. Well, not too long now. Not too long. All right. Our background noise sponsor for the audio version of the podcast, City Grind Espresso from the first floor of City Hall. They, of course, closed during the pandemic, but our big thanks to John and Charlie for your support. Thanks also to the patrons of our show on Patreon. We rely on you to keep this podcast going, and seriously, just a few bucks a month really helps out. Thanks for the consideration. We're always working on getting special content for our patrons. Special thanks to Converge Media, too, for airing this on their channel as well. All right, let's go with Right Here, Right Now. All right, so this part of the program, we're working on what's happening right now in Seattle area politics. And on the docket this week, Kevin, I think it's really interesting, this idea of the Seattle City Council kind of stepping up the pressure, I guess, on restaurant delivery services that they are arguing are really gouging the public. So can we talk about this?
Yeah, so, there was this emergency order that Mayor Durkin passed a while back.
Back in June,
Back in June, earlier on in the COVID crisis, to make sure that restaurant delivery companies weren't, gouging restaurants who are, trying to, keep things going with really high commissions. Now, it turns out, now that this has been in place for a little while, they had a little legislative oopsie with this, which is that the Seattle Municipal Code says that for an emergency declaration like the mayor did with this, the only kind of enforcement for a violation of it is trying to convict somebody of a criminal misdemeanor.
In criminal court, right, yeah.
Well, in criminal court, and, and by the way, this hasn't been updated since 1973.
Right.
So it says that specifically the punishments for this, for violating a civil emergency order are misdemeanor, fine of up to $500 or jail for up to 180 days.
Right.
And which seems a little not quite aligned with what they intended to do with this whole restaurant delivery commissions thing.
Yeah.
So there's two pieces of legislation working their way through the council committees right now. One actually would update that 1973 statute to say, well, okay, you can do a misdemeanor, though it should be just aligned with everything else the way we do it in 2020.
Right.
It should be up to $1,000 and up to 90 days in jail. You could also do a civil infraction instead, which means it doesn't have to go through the courts. That's something that administratively that the city can actually do, although you can challenge it with a hearing examiner.
Right.
And then the third is, there's a potential option for a private right of action, right? So, for example, a restaurant could actually, if they were being gouged, could actually sue the restaurant delivery company to get repayment for what they were overcharged for this. And for any particular instance of a civil emergency order, the mayor would have to say, okay, here are the which of these different kinds of enforcement mechanisms are in place for that, which kind of leads to the second part of this, which is the second thing that the council is doing is a modification to the mayor's emergency order, which says, okay, we can make this a civil infraction instead of a misdemeanor. And also a private right of action.
And this piece is important. It might seem like something that's kind of caught up in the Seattle process, if you will, but I think this is really important because we are talking about people that are delivering food in some potentially dangerous times. At least that's how the council is looking at this, and the mayor is looking at this too. Your thoughts on that piece? These are people who, a lot of times when they are delivering food, are at the front lines of this pandemic when you think about it.
And you know, every major crisis has the opportunity for price gouging, right?
Right.
When things become scarce resources,
Yeah.
and that's important for the city to be handling. At the same time, city needs to be really careful here because it's also putting in place all sorts of other regulations
Yeah.
on TNC companies
Mm-hmm.
and food delivery companies. They're trying to put, you know, premium pay requirements in for drivers and other things.
Oh yeah,
And
Instacart suing the city over that. Yeah.
yeah, and so, you know, they actually have to, you know, hopefully look at the big picture and say, you know, is the collection of things that we're doing
Right.
become so onerous at these companies that they can't make a profit? They just have to pull out entirely.
Right. That's going to be the big challenge ahead for that. Thanks for that breakdown. I wanted to move on to another huge story that is creeping right up on us in terms of a deadline for the Seattle Council to respond to it. I'm talking about the mayor's veto of their most recent budget rebalancing there. But we saw a very interesting piece with this because the big fight back and forth between the mayor and city council has been over the police budget. And just in this past week, we saw Merrick Bobb step down here. He, of course, is the federal monitor that has been overlooking this consent decree process that the Seattle Police Department has been under for the past 8 years. He's resigned. He's been talking to the press, Kevin, saying the SPD has lost ground in this process, which was on track to really start wrapping up earlier this year, but not now, he's saying, after the way the SPD used crowd control weapons during the protest this summer. He's saying the SPD is at its lowest point. A nadir, he told the Seattle Times, needs a new chief from outside the organization. Kevin, I just wanted to ask, what do you make of what Merrick Bobb is saying? How does this impact the council and mayor's tussle over police funding, do you think?
Well, you know, he's certainly not the only one who's been saying these sorts of things.
Yeah.
If you go back to the last time we had a search for a police chief, you know, this
Carmen Best was not the top choice of the mayor. I remember
well,
that.
but not only she was not the top choice, and you know, the mayor created a search committee to go interview, you know, come up with a bunch of names, interview a bunch of people, and come up with a recommendation of a top 5.
Yeah.
Right. And Carmen Best was in the top 10, but she didn't make the top 5.
Yeah.
But along with the recommendation of the top 5, the search committee, which had a pretty diverse group of people in it, delivered a very clear message that they thought Seattle really needed an external police chief.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we've heard this before.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And, you know, I think
that's what ushered in Kathleen O'Toole, you could argue. Yeah.
Merrick Bobb, you know, is rightly pointing out that things do look pretty bad right now, which is, I mean, it's strange because back in January, they did look pretty good.
I was just going to say, yeah, they were set to come out of the consent decree not all that long ago.
Mostly,
yeah,
not entirely.
Right.
They still have to work through some of the, you know, police accountability and SPOG contract stuff.
Yeah.
Other than that, yeah, they're going to get out from it, and now they're just not. Now the whole thing is really up in the air, and it's not clear how they go from here.
Right. I know there's a lot still ahead with that. This new federal monitor we're talking about here, Antonio Oftelli, a Harvard fellow, worked with former SPD Chief Kathleen O'Toole on the future of policing in Ireland. He wrote a crosscut piece, I remember a couple months ago, warning the city council against making feel-good cuts, as he put it, needing to get more buy-in from the government community to reimagine policing. It feels like he's saying some of the right things, Kevin, but what do you think Antonio Oftelli brings to the table here?
Well, I think, you know, he is less of a, you know, of a sort of career civil servant, sort of police, you know, police guy, right?
Yeah,
you
which
know,
was Merrick Bobb's
Merrick Bobb has
background.
been in that
Absolutely.
world for a very, very long time.
Decades,
And so,
yes.
you know, Mr. Oftelli is definitely more of an outsider to that,
Yeah.
and more of an academic. And
Yeah.
you know, it'll be interesting to see what that does. Now, you know, at the same time, Judge Robart also appointed a deputy,
Yes.
Who is much more from the world of sort of police and police accountability.
Manisha Harrell, right? Is that who we're talking about?
Yeah. I think we're going to learn a lot more about both these individuals. You know, as more people get to talk to them, we get to actually see them in action, and they're going to get plenty of opportunity to be in action very shortly because, you know, we're going to be hearing, we've got, you know, the pending issues around the city council's crowd control legislation,
which we're going to talk about in a second. Yep.
And they're going to have to weigh in on that as well.
Yeah. Got so much ahead there. When it gets right down to it, this whole argument over needing a chief from outside the organization, I know that's going to be a big piece here. I know Interim Chief Adrian Diaz has said he wants the job. He wants that permanent job. I wonder about that, Kevin. What do you think is next for Adrian Diaz does the city really need to look outside of Seattle potentially to find that next police chief candidate?
And where would you look?
Right.
I
Who
mean,
wants that job? Sure.
It would be extremely difficult to hire somebody from outside law enforcement.
Yeah.
Right. But every law enforcement agency you look at right now to try to find somebody to lead is going to have all these same issues.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So should they be looking outside SPD as well? Yeah, absolutely they should. And they should be looking at interim Chief Diaz.
Yeah.
And, I don't know what they'll decide on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Right?
Gosh, that's going to be a big job, a big task ahead for the mayor, for the city council as they talk about that. I know Merrick Bob was saying, start that search right away. The mayor, I think, is trying to pump the brakes there a little bit because, I mean, the point being, Kevin, we're right in the middle of a budget rebalancing process that the council and mayor have not agreed to yet. And a big sticking point there is that police budget, which I think is a huge piece of it.
And even that is not going to really solve the issues that the mayor has been raising related to when does she start looking for a new police chief.
Yes.
Right? The big issues are what happens to the 2021 budget and really what happens to the 2022 budget was when they would start to roll out any major, any really significant rethinking and reimagining of the police, right? Now that raises interesting questions of, do you want a new police chief who could be a part of that process of reimagining it? Or do you want to get that figured out and then go find a police chief? Or, could you even find a police chief before that's all worked out? There may be police chiefs who walk in saying, hey, I would love to be a part of that process. And you may find a lot of people say just the opposite, like, I have no idea what I'm getting into.
Right.
And I might find myself 6 months from now just walking away from this because it's a complete train wreck.
Right.
So it's a difficult choice.
Yeah, it will be a difficult choice, a difficult decision ahead for the city as it looks for a new police chief. I'm going to move on to our next piece here. Now hear this. All right, I want to continue our coverage of what's been happening with the council. Its ban on less lethal crowd control weapons, tear gas, pepper spray among them. That ban enacted in June, and if you'll remember, it was blocked by the federal court in July for violating the consent decree the SPD is under, the city is under. And here we are in September. We are hearing some testimony from the city's Office of Professional Accountability, the Inspector General, also the Community Police Commission. This was a very heated meeting at the end of last week, and I want to bring this up. Kevin, I'm going to listen into some of the words of Andrew Meyerberg, the head of the OPA, about when and where officers should be using crowd control weapons.
There are protests where on some occasions, like we saw on May 30th and May 31st, where they may turn into scenes of violence, where you may have cars being burned in the street. There may be times that SPD will be required to disperse those protests. What I'm saying is that there should be tools that allow SPD to do so. I'm not saying that the usage of those tools in every situation is okay. It's not. But I think to take all those tools away and to expect that the city, if in a dire situation, could be kept safe, I think that is an unreasonable request.
Kevin, I really think we're hearing with this, again, the difficulty in changing how to respond in a crowd control situation in a way everybody can agree with. But if I could, I'd like to start with this idea that the council acted too broadly with this ban. I think there might be some agreement that there are cases where some of these weapons are needed. All three of these agencies, the OPA, the OIG, and the CPC, have said this to some extent. Your thoughts about this? Was this too broad of a ban from the city council?
I think it was. I think everyone except Councilmember Swan would probably agree with that.
Yeah, right.
In that,
back to her in a minute. Sure. Okay.
In that, it's crowd control is one situation, and then there's what does the SWAT team do, right? When there's a hostage situation.
Yeah.
Right. If you got an armed suspect holding hostages inside of a building.
Yeah.
And then you've got just regular patrol, right? Where some of the use of force policies and the notion of less lethal weapons has as much to do with having options that are not lethal force, right? Have options, that you can use before you pull out a gun.
Yeah.
As much as it does, what's the next step up from just walking away?
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, in fact, I had a really interesting question about, for context other than crowd control, sort of, do you name them? Should they specifically name them? And,
right.
And
how does that
Inspector General for Public Safety,
forward?
Lisa Judge, said, actually just the opposite, right? Rather than trying to come up with a nomenclature and a taxonomy for everything that isn't crowd control, you should probably sort of do the most restrictions you possibly can for crowd control, because that really sort of goes specifically to a particular case around First Amendment protections and the right of free expression.
Yeah.
And because we know we have issues there, but not try necessarily to bound everything else to specific contexts.
I really thought here, just getting to the whole concept of crowd control, the OPA even said itself that this idea of targeting just the violent people within a peaceful protest, they were talking about this. No agency, no police agency really in the country has figured out how to do that. So I'm just trying to figure out what answers can the council, can the city try to come up with to try to focus in on that one issue? Because I think that's the big piece here. They want to protect the right to a peaceful protest, but they want to try to single out and target those people who are being violent. I just don't know if there are any examples of that actually happening in America today. And I wonder where the city goes with that.
Yeah, I think that's going to be tough. And I think it's very closely related to another issue that came up in that set of conversations a lot, and it has come up in the reports from these groups as well, which is that SPD's crowd control policies, which are, as Lisa Judge said, are essentially, extremely similar to every other law enforcement agency's crowd control policies.
Right. Yeah.
Are really geared, they're optimized around moving crowds. And they're really not good for stationary crowds. So the situations we've seen ourselves over night after night here in Seattle and in Portland and other cities, where a crowd assembles in one place here in Seattle outside the East Precinct, night after night after night, and they're there and they're not moving. Right. The crowd control policies they have in place and the tools and weapons they have in place just don't work well in that environment. And part of that is, if you get a crowd like that and a set of people who are determined to act in violence, insert themselves into the middle of that crowd, what do you do?
Yeah. And I think very important piece of this dynamic, I'm just going to jump in here, Kevin. These are protesters who are protesting the police department specifically. This isn't like we're fighting for the rights of workers in El Salvador. Those are very important, of course. But what we're talking about here is the actual police department. They are clashing with the police themselves with an intent to clash with the police. I think that's a really important part of this dynamic.
Right. And let's take it one step back, right?
Yeah.
Which is that, another way of saying that is the message of these protests is it a protest against police? And that is a specific case that there's also really nothing in the police department's policies around it, but but in that context, the very presence of police is escalating. Or can
escalate things into violence. Sure.
One other comment that Inspector General Lisa Judge said today was, or in that session, was that in those situations, the first option for the police to de-escalate is to reduce their presence, right? Not necessarily altogether, but an option on the table for them has to be, how do we reduce the size of the number of police officers that people see?
Right.
And, and potentially that can include staging officers somewhere else, away from the site, who can get there pretty quickly if the protest does turn violent. Right? And sometimes they do.
Right. Interesting twist on that one, though, and I think this is a really challenging message here, bringing officers away from the scene. I thought we heard a pretty clear message during that hearing, Kevin, that life should be protected at all costs, but, and I don't know if this is an exact quote, but we don't want to be using tear gas when people are breaking windows. And when I think about that, I absolutely understand protecting lives, but I'm also trying to imagine what a property owner who's in the protest area would say, wait a minute, why aren't you protecting my storefront or whatever else? Why is that not important enough for someone to actually exercise some of these crowd control weapons?
And and it was mentioned in that session, and it's come up several times, and will continue to come up, that this is a key policy issue around this, not just specifically at a particular weapon, but this very large question of what is the police protecting and preventing in this? Is it violence against persons and loss of life? Or is it protecting property? And and knowing that all these crowd control weapons can cause injury to people and potential loss of life. How do you trade off the choice to use those kinds of weapons versus property?
Boy.
And it is not as simple. It's easy to come up with soundbite answers to that.
Right.
but really coming up with a workable policy around that is incredibly complicated,
Right.
nuanced,
Yep.
difficult.
Right. And who's in charge of it? The shift commander out there is saying one thing, but do officers themselves have their own right to act independently on something like that? I thought that was an interesting piece here too. And
arguably they have too much discretion today. So you absolutely want them to have the discretion so that if they are being attacked, right, if people are throwing things at them and they are at risk of getting injured, that they have discretion to take action on that. But in the case where somebody's breaking a window, what is acceptable response to that? Right. And particularly in a crowd, ideally the response would be the police officer gets over there and arrests the person doing that.
Sure.
If they're doing it from the middle of the crowd, right, then what do you do? It's incredibly difficult.
I don't know how you parse that out. And I thought there was one other interesting twist, a bit of a news nugget that came out of this. So 18,000 complaints coming in from people during the protests over the last couple months. It sounds like the OPA is going to be putting out reports on 87 of those complaints. They've tried to filter through a lot of these. They're putting out reports on 87 complaints. It sounds like on Friday the 18th or sometime around there here this week. I'm trying to talk about, where do you think that's going to take the discussion, Kevin?
OPA Director Andrew Meyerberg said that some of those will, the findings will be that there were in fact violations by police officers. Some of them will find that there were no violations. So I think it's,
we'll get some data at least, I suppose.
I think the response is going to be a mixed bag. Right? If they cleared everyone, I think it'd be a problem. Right. But it doesn't sound like that's going to happen. Right? I think the devil in a lot of ways is going to be the details, right? Did they clear them of the most significant potential violations? Or did they, until we see it, it's going to be hard to say.
Well, it's going to be an interesting report to check out there, or a series of reports, I should say, from the OPA.
And it's going to be, it's going to be ongoing, right?
They're going to keep on coming out,
and there are more coming in all the time because they keep having protests and they keep having incidents with the police.
Right. Yeah, important to point that out. These protests aren't all necessarily violent. They do involve police sometimes, but not all the time. So important things to keep track of there. All right, I'm going to move on to our final segment here. What's next? All right, Kevin, we have something very interesting to talk about here. I know you've been following this in the courts here. Councilmember Sawant, could she be recalled from office? This is something that has been brewing over the last couple of months here, some ethics issues that the council member is dealing with. I know also some possible implications in terms of marching by Mayor Jenny Durkin's house with a crowd of protesters, et cetera. Your thoughts about this? Where are we in the courts with this case? What's going on?
Yeah, so fortunately, we're all familiar with this process because we've just gone, the recall petition against Mayor Durkin is about a month ahead of this process. Right?
Yes, right.
So they're right at the beginning of this process now. The person has filed a set of charges with the county. And the King County Prosecutor's Office has turned that into a statement of charges and submitted that to King County Superior Court. And on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, there will be a hearing in front of a King County Superior Court judge because the judge has to certify charges to go forward.
Right.
And it's not the judge's job to decide whether the charges being asserted are true or not.
Right. Yep.
The judge has Judge Jim Rogers has two jobs. Number one, to say whether the facts that are being asserted are sufficient, if they're true, which is up to the voters to decide.
Right.
The facts are sufficient to establish the violations of the law that are being asserted.
Yeah.
And number two, if those violations of the law are sufficient to justify a recall, right? And there is a specific legal standard that the violations have to rise to in order to meet that.
Right.
So there's the statement of charges that the King County prosecutor submitted has 6 different charges in there, and that there were, I think, 7 or 8 in the statement of charges against the mayor, and the judge whittled it down to 1. I don't know what's going to happen here.
Yeah.
We'll see what the judge says.
Yeah.
We're any time now, a few days before that hearing, we should be seeing legal briefs filed by both sides,
Right.
by
Right.
Sawant's attorney and by the people who submitted the petition,
Right.
on both sides of the legal validity of this, and
Right.
and then the judge will have to weigh it. So we'll
Yeah.
see.
I know, and I've been reading a lot of the backstory behind this. A few good pieces in the Stranger about it, about some of the people who are donating already to this campaign. I think it's very interesting. Only in-district residents can vote on this issue if indeed it does reach the ballot, which would be April 2021 at the very earliest there. But anybody can donate to this, much like a city council race, I guess you'd say. But in looking at that, these different donations that have come in all around, some people from outside of the area, of course. And then I thought very interestingly, Egan Orion, who was an opponent of Sawant's in the last election here, ended up somehow, some way, getting some of his donor base, some of those people who had signed on to support his campaign. Apparently, they're trying to jump in now on this effort here. There's a lot of political machinations going on behind the scenes here, Kevin, it sounds like.
Yeah, although, Councilmember Sawant should be, she is certainly living in a glass house and should not be throwing stones on this, because in her last campaign, the vast majority of the money that she raised came from not only outside District 3, but outside the state.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
So
that's a good point.
The fact that they're getting, what's interesting about the way the recall campaign is getting donations, is they're asking people to donate $25 or less.
Right.
Which means that they
don't have to provide addresses.
They don't have to collect up all the personal information about those folks. It can all be anonymous donations. And it seems like they've collected an awful lot of money so far with very small donations.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
We'll see what happens there. And if indeed it did go through, I'm looking at some of the numbers here. They would need about 10,000 signatures, a little over 10,000 signatures, or a quarter of the votes cast, which is just over 40,000 in the last election there, for this to go through. So we will see what happens there. I know Councilmember Sawant's office is planning a big Shama Solidarity rally on September 16th. We'll see what happens with that one, and a lot still ahead.
That's the morning. She's planning it for half an hour before the court case.
Yeah, no, she knows.
And the judges, however, are not politicians, and they generally don't take fondly to people trying to put political pressure on them to do things. So having a rally outside the courthouse, I don't think it's going to get the judge aligned with her too much.
All right, fair enough. And folks, we always try to finish up our good old coffee break podcast here with some sweetness. We have been sampling small bakeries all around Seattle. We invite you to keep on doing that, women and Black-owned bakeries especially, and some home baking too. Kevin went a little bit off the trail here, and my daughter's created some panna cotta, if you will. If you can watch it wiggle, see it jiggle there.
Nice.
I've basically been informed that if I eat this before dessert tonight, I will be impaled on a wooden spoon. So I didn't want that to happen. So I'm not actually going to, I can't be doing that. But this is one of those awesome chilled treats that is so great on a summer day. I think people think bakery, they think, oh, something warm, fresh out of the oven. But sometimes you can get those cool things too. And it's quite a treat that I'm in line for. So I don't know. Your thoughts on creating those different things like panna cotta out there. It's a challenge.
Like, rice pudding is another one that goes in there. It's just like, and then there's, if you got an ice cream churn, just being able to, buy one of those electric ice cream makers where you put the big, dish in the freezer for a couple of days, let it get really cold, and do that. Yeah. I made some pear sorbet.
Oh, wow. Which was
super. I mean, it's really super easy. It's basically, it's a can of pears and heavy syrup.
Okay.
A little extra sugar, a little bit more flavoring, and you're good to go.
Wow. You had me at sugar. That sounds all right.
You put it in the blender, just blend it up so it's really all pureed, and then just dump it in the ice cream maker, and half an hour later you got awesome.
That's the good stuff.
Pear pair sorbet.
Well, I can't eat the panna cotta, so I'm just going to put this back in the fridge, and I'll kick it over at your place, and we'll get the sorbet going.
You got a fridge in your little studio?
I need it. Yeah, a little dorm fridge in there.
I have a little dorm fridge in my office here.
We'll talk to Omari about that. See if we can get that requisition in here. Kevin, thank you as always for being on the program. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian.
All right. And thanks everybody for listening in here. The next time you want to know what's happening in local politics, give us a listen on Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Find out what's brewing. You can subscribe on iTunes or Spotify. Please support us on Patreon if you like what you're hearing. Thanks always to Converge Media for carrying this podcast. And thanks everybody out there for listening. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2020.